The sound started on a Tuesday. That was how people would remember it later, when remembering had become something they did with a different quality of attention than before. A rhythmic scrape and thud day after day coming from the cabin at the edge of the settlement. Not the clean split of an axe through dry wood, not the ring of a hammer finding its mark. Something duller and more patient than either of those things. The sound of earth being moved. Men riding the track to the river would rein their horses and sit for a moment listening. Women carrying water from the creek would stop and shade their eyes toward the cabin, squinting against the flat light of the Great Plains sky. And they would see her there, a solitary figure in a faded work dress, her face marked with soil, her arms moving with the steady rhythm of someone who had made a decision and was not reconsidering it. She was digging. Not a well, not a root cellar beside the house where a root cellar made sense. She had pulled up the floorboards inside her own cabin, and with a shovel and a bucket, she was excavating the ground beneath her own feet. The pile of dark earth growing beside her door was a testament to something no one could quite agree on what. By the end of the first week, the pile was waist-high. By the end of the second, it rose above the cabin's single front window like a small, dark hill. The settlement had opinions about this. The settlement always had opinions. It was a community of 60 people in the middle of a landscape that offered very little in the way of distraction, which meant that the behavior of neighbors served functions that theater and newspapers served in other places. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone knew everyone's business. And when someone's business became as visible as a growing mountain of excavated earth beside a cabin door, the opinions organized themselves quickly and without much variation. Rowena Marsh had lost her mind was the general consensus. That was the charitable version. She was 64 years old. Her husband had died at the end of the previous winter, a slow sickness that had taken most of his last season and all of his remaining strength, leaving Rowena with the cabin, a small amount of carefully saved money, and no clear path forward. She had no livestock. She had no garden to speak of, no established beds, nothing growing that would carry her through the coming cold. She had not remarried. She had not appealed to the settlement's informal structures of mutual support, which was a choice people noticed and did not entirely approve of. What she had was the shovel, and the sound it made day after day that carried across the flat ground and lodged in the awareness of everyone within earshot. Corbett Hale was the first to address it directly. Corbett was 60 years old, broad across the chest, a man who had appointed himself the settlement's moral center through the simple mechanism of acting like one long enough that the role had solidified around him. He was not a bad man. He was the kind of man who becomes a problem when he stops questioning his own authority, which had happened to Corbett Hale some years earlier and had not been corrected since. He stopped one afternoon with two men behind him, his thumbs in his belt, studying the pile of excavated earth. "What in God's name are you doing to your own home?" he said. Rowena was at the bottom of what had become at that point a significant excavation. She drove the shovel into the compacted earth, leveraged it with her whole body weight, and transferred another load to the bucket at her feet. She did not look up immediately. "Improving it," she said. The word fell into the air and sat there. It did not invite further questions. It created them. Corbett looked at this pile at the cabin, at the opening in the floor visible through the doorway. He made a sound in his chest, dry dismissive, and turned to the men with him. "Improving it. A badger would be proud of that hole." The men chuckled. The name arrived in that moment, born from Corbett's contempt and the laughter that followed it. The widow's dirt hole. It moved through the settlement with the speed that names always move through small communities, faster than news, faster than rumor, with the adhesive quality of a phrase that captures what a group of people has already decided to believe. Rowena heard it. She heard it at the general store when she came for flour and salt, the conversations that paused and then resumed at a slightly different angle when she entered. She saw the looks, not hostile exactly, not in most cases, but carrying the particular quality of attention that people give to someone they have decided is an object of interest rather than a person of standing. She did not explain herself. She did not defend herself. She paid for her goods with the careful economy of someone watching a finite sum diminish, and she walked back through the flat yellow light to the sound of her own work. The hole grew deeper. It was no longer a hole, it was a chamber. She worked by the light of a single lantern as the autumn days shortened the air below, smelling of damp earth, and her own effort, the walls around her pressing close with the specific intimacy of underground spaces. The work was what it was brutal in the way of sustained physical labor, the kind that tears open calluses and builds them back thicker, that lights a fire in the lower back that never fully extinguishes, that demands total presence because the moment attention wanders is the moment the body reminds you it is made of breakable things. But with every bucket she raised and emptied, something settled into Rowena Marsh that had not been settled since her husband drew his last breath in the bed they had shared for 31 years. A quiet, not the quiet of absence, which was what the cabin held at night and had held since the winter. This was the quiet of purpose, the quiet of a woman who knows what she is doing and why she is doing it, even if no one else does. She shored the walls with thick planks salvaged from a collapsed barn several miles out, a task that had required a week of careful hauling and the use of muscles she had not asked that much of in years. She fitted them against the excavated earth and braced them and tested them the way someone tests anything they intend to trust with something important. She built a sturdy ladder from the pieces that remained. She descended and ascended that ladder dozens of times each day until the motion became automatic, until her body knew the rungs the way it knew the floorboards of the cabin above. Above her, the settlement went about its autumn work. Gardens were tended with the focused urgency of communities that understand the relationship between harvest and survival. The tomatoes were everyone's particular pride and particular anxiety grown tall on their stakes, the leaves an almost aggressive green, the fruit moving through its slow transformation from hard green to yellow to the deep promising red that meant preservation and sustenance through the months when nothing grew. They represented security. They represented the difference between adequate and not. Rowena had no such garden. Her yard held nothing but the great displaced pile of her excavation, which continued to be a source of discussion at the saloon and the general store, and in the spaces between cabins where neighbors gathered to share information and occasionally to agree on what it meant. "She'll be begging for scraps by first frost," Corbett declared with the confidence of a man whose prediction aligns perfectly with what he wants to be true. All that work for nothing but a hole in the ground. Down in the chamber she had made, Rowena was building boxes. Long, deep troughs fitted to the dimensions of the space, filled with a careful mixture of the subsoil she had excavated and the manure she had been composting in a corner of her yard for most of the previous year. She worked with an efficiency that came from planning. She had known what she was going to need before she began, had thought through the sequence of steps the way her husband used to think through carpentry projects, following the logic of each stage until the final result was visible before the first board was cut. From a small cloth bundle, she removed seeds. Her mother had given them to her on the day she left the place where she was born, a departure that had proven permanent in the way that many departures in that era proved permanent. You traveled the distance, and the distance became your life. Her mother had pressed the bundle into her hands on the porch of the farmhouse and said something about carrying home with you wherever you go. Rowena had kept the bundle for 40 years, refreshing the seeds from her own plants, when she had plants protecting the lineage through moves and winters and the ordinary attrition of a long life. She planted them with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable. Each seed pressed to the correct depth, spaced with the attention to detail that her mother had modeled and that she had never stopped practicing. She watered them from the bucket she kept at the base of the ladder, rationed carefully, understanding that water management underground operated by different rules than water management in a surface garden where evaporation and drainage announced themselves. Then she waited. The waiting was not passive. She descended the ladder multiple times each day, checking moisture, checking temperature, checking for the first signs of what she was looking for. The chamber was dark except for her lantern, and the air was still, and the temperature held with a consistency that the world above never achieved. Not the cold of a root cellar, not the warmth of a heated room, but something in between that remained stable while the days outside swung from the last remnant of summer heat to the sharp edge of coming autumn. On a Tuesday evening in midsummer, when the light above ground was still holding gold at the horizon, but the chamber was already fully dark, Rowena descended the ladder with her lantern and saw the first green shoot. It had pushed through the soil of the nearest trough with the particular determination of something alive, asserting itself against resistance. Pale small, its two seed leaves spread like the smallest possible declaration of intent. She knelt beside it, The lantern light moved across the surface of the soil across the other troughs where nothing yet showed across the plank walls she had built with her own hands from salvaged lumber hauled over bad roads. The chamber smelled of earth and moisture, and something organic and alive that had not been there before. She stayed there for a long time. She was 64 years old and she had buried a husband and sold the livestock and watched the settlement form its opinion of her and had not argued with any of it. She had simply dug. She had planted seeds her mother gave her in ground she had made herself, and the first of those seeds had answered. She was not the kind of woman who assigned large meanings to small events. She had lived long enough to know that sentiment and reality did not always align, and that the gap between them was where foolishness lived. But she sat in the lamplight in the chamber beneath her cabin floor and let herself feel what she felt, which was something she had not felt since before her husband's last autumn. Not grief, not its absence either. Something that existed in a different register entirely. She felt like herself. By the time the shoots had become seedlings, by the time the seedlings had found the trellises she had built for them and begun their upward reach, the chamber had become her true residence. She spent more time below than above. The cabin on the surface had become a lid over her real life, a threshold she crossed multiple times each day without much thought, the way you cross a threshold between rooms. The settlement's curiosity had passed from mockery toward a more active variety of confusion, because there was a new development. On the south-facing slope of the cabin roof, Rowena had removed a section of shingles. In their place, with great care and some difficulty, she had installed a series of glass panes she had obtained through a trade she had thought carefully about and decided was worth making. Her husband's good coat, the one she had kept folded at the bottom of the trunk because it still smelled of him, and she had not been able to give it to anyone, had become glass. The panes were old, slightly warped, admitting a greenish and imperfect light, but they caught the high summer sun and directed it downward into the chamber. The angle required calculation. She had done the calculation over several evenings with pencil and a piece of paper, working out the geometry of it the way her father had once worked out carpentry angles, following the logic until the answer was clear. Now that specific window of light fell across the trellises each morning and moved across them through the afternoon hours before withdrawing. And the plants, which had been growing with a certain determinedness in the lantern light alone, responded to natural light with something that could only be described as eagerness. They darkened. They thickened. They reached. Small yellow flowers appeared and then gave way to the green nubs of infant tomatoes. Now it was a strange sight, a patch of glass on a cabin roof glittering in the sun, and from that roof, at the right time of day, you could see the light going down into the floor rather than bouncing back up into the sky. People noticed. The story changed shape. Now she was putting windows in the floor. Now she was watching the sky from the bottom of her hole. Now she had truly lost whatever grip on ordinary sense she had maintained up until this point. The laughter was there. It was always there, but it was starting to change quality, because the sheer persistence of the work was hard to ignore, even for people who had decided what to think about it. You could mock a woman who dug a hole. You could mock a woman who planted seeds in the dark. But there was something about the sustained, deliberate nature of Rowena Marsh's effort. The hauled lumber, the careful troughs, the traded coat, the calculated angle of the glass that did not quite fit inside the word foolish, even for those who were most committed to using it. Cressida Birch was the first to come and ask. She lived on the next claim, 50 years old, a woman with capable hands and a worried face that the autumn had made more worried than usual. She found Rowena stacking firewood one evening in the cooler air and stopped at the fence. "The almanac says there's a frost coming early this year," Cressida said. "A hard one. We're going to lose half the tomatoes if it comes when they're saying." Rowena looked at her. She set the piece of wood she was holding onto the stack with care. "The almanac is often right," she said. Cressida lingered. Her eyes moved despite themselves to the loose section of floorboards, visible through the open cabin door, to the shape of the glass panels on the roof catching the last of the evening light. "They say you've been digging," Cressida said. "Down there." Rowena looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "For the warmth," just those two words. Cressida stared at her. The answer made no sense. A hole was a cold place, everyone knew that. A grave was a cold place. A root cellar was cold. That was what underground meant in the common understanding of the thing. She shook her head and left more unsettled than when she had arrived. But that evening, one thought found her repeatedly as she moved through the tasks of closing the house for the night, a thought she could not organize into a coherent argument, but could not entirely dismiss either. Rowena Marsh had been wrong about nothing yet. The idea was uncomfortable. She set it aside and went to sleep. In the chamber beneath the cabin floor, the tomatoes ripened in the warm and stable air that the surrounding earth provided in the light that came down through warped glass at the precise angle a 64-year-old widow had calculated on a piece of paper over 3 quiet evenings. The fruit was deep and red, and heavy clusters of it hanging from the vines in the dark. Above them, the settlement tended its surface gardens and watched the sky with the anxiety of every harvest season. The tomatoes on their tall stakes were almost ready. A few more weeks of warmth, the growers said. A few more weeks, and the preserving jars would be full. They did not know yet what a few more weeks would cost them. They did not know that the answer had been growing underground in the dark all summer long. The answer that everyone had laughed at. The frost came on a Wednesday. Not the gentle kind that arrives like a suggestion dusting the grass with white and retreating by mid-morning, as if it had only stopped by to remind you of what was coming. This frost came with intention. It settled over the settlement in the deep, moonless hours before dawn, silent and thorough, pressing down on everything that was still alive and growing with the patient finality of a hand smoothing a sheet over something that no longer needed to breathe. Rowena felt it before she saw it. She woke at 4 in the morning, which was earlier than her usual rising called up from sleep by something she could not name until she was fully awake and lying in the dark of the cabin, listening to the specific quality of the silence outside. There was a texture to it, a weight, the silence of a world that has been stopped. She dressed in the dark and went outside. The stars were brilliant in a sky that had cleared completely during the night, the kind of sky that forms when every particle of moisture has been driven from the air, and what remains is pure cold and pure dark. Her breath made clouds that dissolved immediately. The ground under her boots was hard in a way it had not been the night before. She stood in front of the cabin for a moment and looked out at the settlement. Then she went back inside and descended the ladder. The chamber was what it always was, still, warm in its consistent underground way, the temperature that the surrounding earth maintained regardless of what the sky decided to do. She moved the lantern slowly through the troughs and checked the plants, with her hands feeling the leaves, the stems, the weight of the fruit. Everything was as it had been the evening before. Everything was alive and producing and unhurried. She stayed down there for an hour. When she came back up through the trapdoor and went outside again, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. And in that first gray light, she could see what the night had done to the settlement's gardens. The broad leaves of the squash plants were black. Not the gradual yellowing of autumn senescence, but the sudden catastrophic blackening of cells destroyed by freezing. The plant's water turned against itself. The membranes ruptured, the structure of living things collapsed from within. The beanstalks that had stood so upright were wilted to the ground. And the tomatoes, the staked, careful, almost ready tomatoes that had represented the settlement's winter stores, hung on vines that had gone the color of ash, their fruit beginning the visible process of turning to the soft and watery ruin of things that have been frozen and are now rotting in slow motion. A season's work, gone between dark and dawn. Rowena stood at the edge of her yard and looked at it for a while. Then she went inside and started her fire and made her coffee and descended the ladder to begin the morning's work of watering and checking and tending what she had grown in the dark. The grief spread through the settlement by mid-morning. People walked out to their gardens and stood in front of what had been there, and then stood in front of what was there now, which was the same arrangement of plants and stakes and climbing vines, but transformed into something that would feed no one. The sound of it was quiet, the sound of communities absorbing a loss that is too large for immediate expression, not silence exactly, but the muffled, directionless sound of people moving through shock toward the harder country of comprehension. By afternoon, the talk had started. By evening, the calculations were being made, the inventories taken of what had been put up already, what was stored, what could be stretched, and what could not. The winter was long in that part of the world, and what had just been destroyed in one night was not replaceable by any ordinary means. Corbett Hale sat at his table and stared at the wall with the expression of a man whose prediction of other people's failure has been overtaken by a larger failure that includes his own. Millicent Hale, his wife, 58 years old, and a woman who had come to her opinions through observation rather than assumption, and who therefore held them with greater justification than her husband held his, had not sat at the table. She had put on her coat. She had stood at the door for a moment thinking about something that had been in her mind since the previous autumn. Then she had walked down the track toward the cabin at the edge of the settlement. She knocked. Rowena opened the door and looked at her. Millicent Hale was the wife of the man who had named the dirt hole. She had stood beside him on the occasions when he had performed his dismissals for the benefit of those around him. She had not laughed exactly. Millicent was not given to public cruelty, but she had not objected either. And Rowena knew that the decision not to object was its own position. The two women looked at each other in the doorway. Then Rowena stepped back. "Come inside," she said. Millicent came in. She stood in the dim interior of the cabin, taking in its spare furnishings, the single chair, the bed against the far wall, the absence of the small, decorative accommodations that most women made to their living spaces. Her eyes moved to the center of the floor, to the section of boards that was clearly not fixed in the way the others were fixed. Rowena walked to the center of the room and gripped the edge of the trap door. She pulled it open. She picked up the lantern from the floor where it waited and held it so the light went down into the space below. She looked at Millicent. "Follow me," she said. Millicent looked into the darkness. She could smell it now. Not the smell of cold earth, not the smell of damp and rot that she would have expected from a hole in the ground. Something else. Something alive. She put her foot on the first rung. The descent was 8 rungs slow, her hands gripping the sides of the ladder with the care of someone not accustomed to underground spaces. When her boots touched the packed earth floor and she straightened and Rowena raised the lantern, the sight that met her was so contrary to what her eyes had spent the morning looking at that for a moment her mind simply refused it. The chamber was warm, not heated room warm, but alive warm, the warmth of a space that has been insulated from the worst of what the world outside can produce. The walls were close but solid, planked with salvaged lumber, fitted with care. The troughs ran in rows, and from the troughs rose the vines, and on the vines hung the fruit. Tomatoes. Clusters of them, deeply red, heavy on the stems, some of them large enough that the weight of them had pulled the vines down against the trellises and held them there. The smell was extraordinary. The sharp green smell of the vines combined with the rich ripeness of the fruit, a smell that belonged entirely to summer, and had no business being in this underground space in the aftermath of a killing frost. Millicent stood very still. She had walked out to her own garden that morning and seen what the night had done. She had looked at the blackened leaves, the ruined fruit, the wasted labor of months. She had stood at the edge of her devastation and tried to begin calculating forward, the way you have to calculate forward in situations like this, because the alternative to calculating forward is to stop. And now she was standing in a chamber beneath the floor of a widow's cabin, looking at summer preserved intact by the stubborn intelligence of a woman the settlement had spent a year calling foolish. How she whispered. Her voice was barely above a breath. Rowena moved the lantern. She touched one of the ripe tomatoes gently, the way you touch something you have been tending for months and have a relationship with. "The earth," she said. She ran her hand along the wall of the chamber. "It holds the warmth. The summer goes into the ground and stays." She paused. "The same way the cold stays in a cellar but turned around. Summer going down instead of winter." Millicent looked at the walls, at the ceiling of planks above them, at the troughs and the vines and the impossible harvest. She did not fully understand the mechanism. But she understood what was in front of her and what was not in front of everyone else in the settlement this morning, and the relationship between those two facts was very clear. The news moved through the settlement the way the frost itself had moved quietly in the dark, covering everything before anyone had decided how to respond to it. Millicent told her nearest neighbor told 2 more. By the following morning, the story had reached every cabin in the settlement, had been told and retold and debated and disbelieved and debated again. The disbelievers went to see for themselves, which was the only argument that settled anything. Corbett Hale came on the second day. He did not ask permission. He walked into the cabin and stood in the middle of the floor and looked at the trap door with the expression of a man who needs to be shown a thing before he can accept it exists. Rowena lifted the door and handed him the lantern without speaking. He descended. The silence that came from below lasted long enough that the small crowd that had gathered outside the cabin door began to exchange glances. Then his boots appeared on the rungs, and then the rest of him, and he stood in the room with his hat in his hands and his face the color of a man whose certainties have just been rearranged by something he cannot argue with. "Sweet Mother of God," he said, quietly to himself or to no one. They came in a steady procession after that. Men and women, both their faces tight with the specific anxiety of people who have lost something irreplaceable and are looking at someone who might be able to help them. They descended the ladder one at a time and stood in the warm underground air among the laden vines, and they were quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are looking at something that embarrasses their recent opinions. The widow's dirt hole was no longer a joke, but the name did not disappear. It changed quality. When people said it now, there was something else in the word, something that sat uncomfortably between the mockery it had been and the reverence it was becoming. A name that had started as an insult trying to figure out what to do with itself now that the insult had been inverted. Cressida Birch came on the third day. She came with a small sack of flour held in both hands, and she came in the afternoon when she knew there would be fewer people around to observe the approach. She stood at the cabin door and looked at the ground when Rowena opened it. She said, "I know it's a great deal to ask." She said, "My family has very little put up for the winter." She said, "Even just a few." She held out the flour. Rowena looked at the sack. She looked at Cressida's face at the set of it, at what it cost her to be standing here with this offering when she had not been among those who argued against the dirt hole, but had not argued for it either. She went inside. She descended the ladder. She came back up with a basket of tomatoes, ripe and red and heavy, and she set them on the table, and she and Cressida looked at them together for a moment. She took the flour and gave Cressida the basket. That was the beginning. Others came with what they had: jars of honey, a bolt of cloth labor promised for the coming spring, a share of venison from a successful hunt. Rowena received each offering and made each exchange with the same economy she brought to everything: no excess warmth and no coldness, either simply the transaction itself conducted with the respect that any honest exchange deserves. She was careful. She knew what she had and what it needed to last. The plants were still producing the warm, stable air of the chamber, maintaining the growing conditions that had been established over months of careful management. But the harvest was not infinite, and the winter ahead was long, and she calculated each exchange against the larger arithmetic of the season. Corbett Hale watched this new economy form and saw in it something that made him uneasy for reasons he could not immediately articulate. He came to her door one evening with two men from the settlement's informal council. His tone was measured, the tone of a man who has decided in advance that he is being reasonable. He said what she had built was remarkable. He said the community was facing a hard winter. He said that in times of genuine need, the resources available to the community needed to be managed for the community's benefit. He said he was prepared to take responsibility for that management. He said all of this with the patient delivery of someone who believes they are explaining something obvious to someone who needs the explanation. Rowena stood in her doorway. She was 64 years old, and she had spent a year digging and building and planting and tending in the face of a community that had decided to find her efforts amusing. She had bought wood with her last money and traded her dead husband's coat for glass and hauled salvaged lumber over bad roads by herself. She had descended and ascended that ladder hundreds of times in the dark and the lantern light, and she had learned the particular patience of growing things, which was a patience built on the understanding that effort and outcome are connected but not immediately. She looked at Corbett Hale and the two men with him. She said, "I dug this." She said, "I timbered it." She said, "I planted it and I tended it." She said, "This harvest is mine." Corbett's expression shifted. He had expected reluctance. He had not expected the door to close, which is effectively what happened. Though no door actually moved, simply the quality of the space between them made it clear that the conversation was over. He left with the men behind him. His face as he walked back down the track carried the stiffness of someone who has been told no, in a way they will spend considerable time deciding how to characterize. The whispers that began after that evening were different from the earlier whispers. The mockery had been contemptuous, but essentially harmless. The way mockery aimed at someone who poses no threat is harmless. This was different. This had need behind it, and need is not harmless. Need can make people calculate in ways they would not otherwise calculate, can make options seem available that would not ordinarily seem available. Rowena felt it. She felt the quality of the attention change, felt the eyes on the cabin at odd hours felt the different weight of the settlement's awareness. She had been an object of amusement. Now she was an object of something more concentrated and more dangerous. She began barring the cabin door at night, which she had not done since the early days of the settlement, when the uncertainty of a new place in new territory made such precautions reasonable. She slept lighter. She kept the iron poker near the hearth within reach from the bed. The winter deepened. The nights grew colder. The inside of the cabin was warm enough, but barely, and she tended the small stove with careful attention to her wood supply, which was finite in the way that everything was finite this winter for everyone in the settlement. Tarleton Pruitt had exchanged a worn shovel head for a basket of tomatoes the week before the bad night. He was 45 with a quiet wife and 3 young children and a worried face that seemed to have been made for worry, structured by decades of harvest anxiety and weather uncertainty, and the general difficulty of making a life on flat land that offered everything to those who could endure it and nothing to those who could not. Rowena had seen him at the exchange. She had seen the relief on his face when he carried the basket home, the particular gratitude of a man who has found a solution to an immediate problem and is not thinking about anything beyond it. She had not thought about him again until the night the wind started. The storm came in from the northwest, the way the worst storms did, building through the afternoon into a sustained howl by evening that found every gap in the cabin's walls and reminded her of the ones she had not yet sealed. She banked the stove and went to bed early, listening to the wind work at the structure around her. She woke at 2 in the morning to a sound that was not wind. It was coming from above, from the roof. A scraping, deliberate sound, the sound of a tool being applied to something with intention. Her mind organized it immediately, not a branch, not debris, not the wind's improvisation. A person, on her roof, with something in their hand. She was on her feet before she had completed the thought. She took the lantern, she took the iron poker. Her bare feet found the floor, and she crossed to the center of the room and looked up, and in the lantern light she could see through the gap where the glass panes met the roof boards, the edge of a shadow moving against the moonlit sky. He had a crowbar. She could hear it now, the specific sound of a pry bar inserted under the edge of a frame, the creak of resistance. He was working at the glass. She did not deliberate. She went to the door and lifted the bar and went outside into the wind and cold in her bare feet and night clothes, and she looked up at her roof. Tarleton Pruitt was on the slope of the roof, his coat dark against the pale moonlit shingles, the crowbar in his hand. He was working at the edge of the glass frame, his movements systematic, the movements of a man who has made a decision and is executing it. She looked at him for a moment. Then the crowbar came down and one of the glass panes broke. The sound of it was small against the wind, but what it meant was not small. Cold air was already beginning to move through the break, the careful thermal balance of the chamber below, beginning its shift toward the outside temperature, toward the same temperature that had destroyed every tomato plant in the settlement weeks before. Tarleton, she said, her voice cut through the wind. He froze on the roof and looked down at her, and his face in the moonlight was the face of a man who has surprised himself, who has done the thing he decided to do, and had now, having done it, encountering the reality of having done it. My family, he said. His voice was strained with cold and something worse than cold. They're sick. They need the food. We have nothing left. She looked at him. This is not the way, she said. He looked at the crowbar in his hand. He looked at the broken pane. He looked at Rowena standing on the frozen ground below him in the winter night, with bare feet and a poker in her hand, and she could see him, see what he had done and what it was and what it meant. He raised the crowbar again. She did not hesitate. She bent and found a piece of firewood from the stack beside the cabin wall, a solid piece dry and dense, and she threw it. She had been throwing things all her life the way people who do physical work for decades develop specific competencies without particularly trying. The wood spun through the moonlit air and struck the roof slope near his feet with a sound like a shot. Tarleton Pruitt flinched, lost his footing on the frost-slicked shingles. His boots skidded and his arms went wide, and then he was sliding the crowbar clattering loose, and he came off the edge of the roof and landed on the frozen ground with a heavy final sound. He lay still for a moment. Then he made a sound that was more animal than anything, and she knew from the angle of his left leg what had happened to it. She stood over him in the cold. The wind moved the loose end of his coat. His breath came in short white bursts. His face turned toward her from the ground carried an expression that had passed through shock into something raw, the face of a man who understands exactly what he has done and what it has cost him and what it costs everyone else. Rowena looked at him for a long moment. The broken glass on her roof was letting cold into the chamber below. Every minute the break stayed open, the temperature in that space moved further from what she had spent a year creating and closer to what had killed every garden in the settlement. She looked at the roof. She looked at Tarleton on the ground. She set the poker against the cabin wall. She went inside. She came back out with 2 blankets and she covered him. She went back inside again and came out with the short planks she kept for repairs and the cloth she used for insulation work, and she climbed the ladder she kept at the side of the cabin, and she went up onto the roof in the wind barefoot on the frost-covered shingles, and she began to work. The cold was the first thing she had to solve. Every minute she spent on the ground with Tarleton's was a minute the broken pane let outside air into the chamber. She understood this with the clarity of someone who has built a thing carefully and knows exactly what threatens it. The thermal balance she had established over months was not fragile in the way of delicate things. It was robust, built into the earth itself, sustained by the mass of the surrounding soil. But it was not indestructible either, and a breach in the glass at the worst hour of the worst night of the winter was the kind of threat that required immediate attention. She had covered him. That was the first thing. Now she went back up. The roof slope was treacherous in the way that frost-covered surfaces are treacherous at 2 in the morning. Not impossible, but demanding complete attention, every shift of weight considered. Before it was committed, the body managing itself with the specific care of someone who cannot afford to follow Tarleton off the edge. She had the planks under one arm and the oilcloth under the other, and she moved across the shingles with the methodical patience she had been practicing in one form or another for the better part of a year. The broken pane was not large. That was the saving piece of luck in the situation, if luck was the right word for anything happening on this particular night. One pane from the center of the arrangement cracked through its center and partially dislodged from the frame. Cold air was coming through the gap. Yes, she could feel it on her face as she leaned over the opening, the draft from below where the chamber's relative warmth was being drawn upward and replaced with the freezing air that pressed down from above. She worked. She fitted the plank across the gap at the angle that would shed the wind rather than collect it. She pressed the oilcloth beneath it as a seal, tucking it against the remaining glass on both sides with fingers that had stopped registering temperature as a feeling and started registering it only as information about what the fingers could and could not do. She had spare nails in her coat pocket from the habit of always carrying what she might need, and she drove them through the plank into the roof boards with the hammer she had brought up inside the fold of the oilcloth. Not beautiful, not permanent, but sound in the way that things built from what is available in the moment of necessity are sometimes sound a solution that addresses the immediate problem and holds it at bay long enough for a better solution to become possible. She tested the edges of the seal with her palm. The draft was reduced to almost nothing. She descended the roof and the ladder and stood on the frozen ground and looked at what she had done for a moment. Then she turned to Tarleton. He had not moved from where he lay, except that his right hand had come to rest on the blanket she had put over him, gripping it with the involuntary hold of someone in pain who needs something to hold. His leg was wrong in a way that could not be fixed by the morning sun, only managed until something better than management was available. She knelt beside him. She did not speak first. She examined the leg with her hands in the moonlight, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who has set broken things before, not bones specifically, but other things, and who knows that the principle is the same. You work with what the structure tells you rather than against it. He made a sound when she touched the brake. She acknowledged it with a brief pressure of her hand on his shoulder and continued working. She had the planks. She had the cloth. She improvised a splint in the dark and the cold, bracing the leg against further movement, binding it with the methodical wrapping she used for insulation work, the strips tight enough to hold, but not so tight as to cause additional harm. When she was done, she sat back and looked at what she had made. Then she went inside and came back with a basket. She set it beside him in the dark. The moonlight fell across the tomatoes inside it, their red darkened to something richer in the cold blue light. She helped him up. This was the hardest physical thing she had done in a year of hard physical things. He was not a small man, and his leg would not bear weight, and the ground was frozen, and she was 64 years old. But she had been doing impossible-seeming things, one incremental step at a time, for long enough that she knew how to approach this one, not as a whole, not as the entire distance from the ground to his cabin door, but as the next place to put a foot, and then the next, and then the one after that. They crossed the settlement in the deep cold of the pre-dawn dark. She left him at his door. She did not go in. She did not explain herself to his wife, who opened the door with a face that told its own story of worry and long waking. She set the basket inside the door and turned and walked back through the cold to her own cabin. She descended the ladder. The chamber was what it was. Slightly cooler than it had been, she could feel the difference with her face and hands. Not dramatic but real, the effect of the broken glass in the hours before she had sealed it. She moved through the troughs with the lantern, checking leaves and stems and fruit, with her hands looking for the signs of cold stress, the subtle wilting at leaf edges, the slight change in stem texture that preceded damage. She found none. The earth had held. The mass of soil surrounding the chamber had absorbed the cold air and refused to give up what it had spent months accumulating. The plants were where they had been before the night started. The fruit was where it had been. The warmth was reduced but not broken. She sat on the floor of the chamber for a while. The lantern made its small, steady light. The roots of the trellis vines were visible at the edge of the nearest trough, pale and purposeful in the dark soil. Above her, through the plank floor of the cabin, she could hear the wind beginning to ease the storm, losing the energy it had spent on the night and retreating towards something more ordinary. She thought about Tarleton on the roof with the crowbar. She thought about the basket she had left inside his door. She tried to locate in herself the anger that seemed like it should be there, and found that it was not there or not in the form she expected it. What she found instead was something tireder and more complicated, the recognition that a man doing a desperate thing from desperation was not the same as a man doing a cruel thing from cruelty, and that the difference mattered even when the outcome was broken glass on a winter night. She had never been good at sustaining anger. Her husband used to say she burned through it too fast, that she went from angry to done with it in the time it took other people to get properly started. She had never decided whether that was a virtue or a limitation. Perhaps it was simply what she was. She climbed back up the ladder. She barred the door and went back to bed. She slept. By morning, Tarleton had told his wife everything. That was what she learned afterward, that he had lain in the narrow bed beside her through the last hours of darkness and told her all of it, not in the way of someone managing a story, but in the way of someone who can no longer carry the weight of what they have done and needs to set it down in the only place available. His wife had listened. By the time the settlement was fully awake, the story had moved through it. This story moved differently from the earlier ones. The mockery had moved fast and loose, the way stories move when they're being carried by laughter. This story moved with a different weight, slow and deliberate person to person, carrying the specific quality of something that requires the listener to sit with it before passing it on. People heard it and went quiet and then went to find someone else who had already heard it and talk about what it meant. Corbett Hale heard it at 8 in the morning from the man who lived 2 doors from the Pruitts. He sat at his table after the man left. Millicent sat across from him. She did not speak. She had learned in their years together when Corbett needed to be left alone with a thing and when he needed to be moved. She watched his face and decided this was a time for both a few minutes of the former than the latter. She said after a while, "What are you going to do?" He did not answer immediately. He looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the window through which the light of a cold, clear morning was coming in straight and clean. He looked at something that was not in the room, something interior, the accounting that a person conducts when events have made the ordinary accounting insufficient. He was not a man who apologized easily. He had built most of his adult life on a structure of confidence that did not have a natural place for apology. Confidence in his own judgments, in his understanding of what things meant and what people should do. He had appointed himself a center and had held that position, and the holding of it had required him to be right more often than not, or at minimum to be certain. He had been wrong about the dirt hole. He had named it and mocked it and organized the settlement's dismissal of it, and it had turned out to be the most important thing built in the settlement in years. That was one wrong. He had tried to take it from her. He had walked to her door with the language of the community's welfare and tried to transfer her creation into his management, and she had refused him, and she had been right to refuse him. That was a second wrong, and on the night that followed all of that, a man from his settlement had gone onto her roof with a crowbar, and she had stopped him and splinted his leg in the dark and carried food to his children, and no one had asked her to, and no one had watched her do it. Corbett pushed back his chair. He put on his coat. He put on his hat. He looked at Millicent. "Come with me," he said. They walked to the cabin at the edge of the settlement in the cold morning air. They were joined on the way by others who had heard the story and had reached their own conclusions about what this morning required. By the time they reached the cabin door, there were 14 people behind Corbett and Millicent, a gathering that had assembled without being called the way gatherings do. When a community feels a shared obligation, it cannot articulate, but also cannot ignore. Corbett knocked. The door opened. Rowena looked at him. She looked at Millicent. She looked at the people behind them. Her face did not change much. She had the quality of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by what the world puts in front of her. Corbett took off his hat. He had been working on words during the walk. He had composed sentences and rejected them, and composed more because he understood that this was a moment that required language adequate to what had happened, and he was not certain he possessed such language. In the end, what came out was simpler than anything he had planned. He said we were wrong. He said it to Rowena's face and not to the ground or the middle distance. He said, we let our fear make us into something ugly. What Thomas did last night was unforgivable. What you did after he stopped. He started again. We have no right to ask you for anything, but the glass is broken and we want to fix it. Rowena looked at him for a long moment. She opened the door. Orrin Vance was already moving before anyone spoke. He was a man of 55 who had learned carpentry from a father who had learned it from necessity, and he had brought his tools on the walk to the cabin because he had known before he arrived what the work was. He went around the side of the cabin to where he could see the repair Rowena had made in the night, the plank, the oilcloth, the improvised seal that had held against the cold, and he looked at it with the assessing eye of a craftsman reading someone else's emergency work. He said nothing. He climbed the ladder. The women went inside. Millicent Hale descended the ladder into the chamber for the second time, but differently from the first. The first time she had descended as a petitioner following a stranger's invitation into a stranger's dark. This time she descended as someone with work to do, and the others followed her. They moved through the troughs carefully with the deference of people who understand they are in the presence of something that took a long time to grow and can be damaged by inattention. The broken glass had fallen into the soil of the nearest trough, some pieces large and some fragments nearly invisible in the dark soil. They gathered them with slow, careful hands, working by lantern light, sifting the earth gently for shards that might damage the roots or cut the hands of anyone who worked the soil afterward. Cressida Birch had brought glass. She had thought of it on the walk over, had turned back to her cabin and retrieved 2 frames from her wall frames that had held photographs of people who were no longer living, people she had carried across the distance to this place. She had removed the photographs and wrapped them carefully and brought the glass. It was mismatched, and one piece was slightly this time, but just weather. Just the ordinary expression of a landscape doing what landscapes do. Patient and indifferent and very large. She slept.